Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSPmagazine. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Marco.
Sean.
It's really light.
It's light?
The light, yeah.
The light is light?
No,
Wow.
The SAT is light.
The SAT is light. Okay.
That's right. It's not very heavy. It floats. It's so light. Up in the sky, beyond the sky, watching over us, helping us navigate.
Are we in the low Earth orbit, or in the higher one?
Yes.
Yes. The answer is yes. I have no idea what you're talking about, but the answer is yes.
Yes.
No,
let's stay low today. Let's stay low today.
Yeah, we're staying low. And there is a few things that when I was looking at what Johannes here, our guest for today, that we will introduce properly in a few seconds, there's a few things that stuck in my mind when I was reading the abstract for his presentation. And a busy low Earth orbit, it's one thing that I always imagine to be a little bit too much traffic for my taste.
Like the Space Traffic Control Center is hard at work, I'm sure.
Yep.
I'm joking, but there's probably something like that. But before we keep messing around any further, Marco, let's introduce Johannes Willbold. How are you, Johannes? Good to have you on the show.
Great. Thanks for having me. How about you?
It's gonna be a fun conversation, driven by a session that you've put together, which was accepted by the incredible and incredibly difficult board at Black Hat. So congratulations!
Very grateful to be there.
Yes, exactly. And it's about low Earth orbit satellites. That's why we're joking about that and analyzing all of that, which we're going to talk about here in a moment. Before we get into that, though, Johannes, a little bit about yourself, what you do, the research you're up to, and what's going on.
Sure. Yeah, so as you already introduced, my name is Johannes Willbold. I'm a doctoral student at the Ruhr University in Bochum, that is in Germany. And I started my PhD basically, I think, a good 2 years ago. And started in a general area of software security, system security, so really looking into systems where you can find vulnerabilities in general. And I quickly switched into the space track, let's say, of that field, because it's space. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory.
Yep.
And there's not a lot of space research, really, so that was pretty intriguing, especially when you look at satellites themselves and satellite software. So really the research that we did was first going out and try to get research satellite software, which is not easy to get, since dumping it from a live satellite is usually, let's say, tricky. So we went out to people, we asked them for firmware, can you give us your firmware? And we figure out what kind of vulnerabilities you might have in your firmware. And that worked decently well. We got several firmware images together, from the University of Tartu for the EST Cube 1, one from the ESA, from the European Space Agency for OPSAT, which is an experimental satellite platform, and one for Flying Laptop, which is basically a technology tester for aerospace and defense. And we then basically went over these and first had a look into satellite systems. I'm really into space, but I never looked into a satellite itself. So really the first stage of our research was figuring out how a satellite works in general, and understanding what the technical difficulties are, not yet on a security level. And then in the next step, jump in and figure out what kind of architectural issues you might see, talking about, for example, the encryption of the commands that go to the satellite. And then in the next step, figuring out what kind of vulnerabilities, what kind of software vulnerabilities you might find that you find on Earth, and also maybe in space, or maybe just some that you only find in space. And this was kind of the first step of our research. And we found definitely quite some interesting things that we can probably go into details in a moment. And yeah, so several issues there.
We can, and I know that we had few conversations. Sean had a little bit more than me in terms of security of satellites, but like I mentioned before we started, we're a good friend with the Aerospace Village at DEF CON, so we're actually going to talk to them later today, and it's a big topic. So before you guys start to dig into the technicality of the security, there is one concept that I would like to kind of ask you to explain for the people that are not too much into this, which is security by obscurity, which is kind of a cool name for a website. But can you explain what that is?
Absolutely. That's a pretty important concept, let's say, for space security, which is kind of unfortunate because security by obscurity is something that you don't really want to have. So security by obscurity says the system is secure because essentially nobody knows how it works or maybe not knows how it works in detail. So really, for example, we had encryption long time ago, and probably still there is some encryption like that only is secure because nobody knows how exactly the steps are to encrypt that. And really what you want to have is like security, well, by design, by default, there are many areas like this, but you basically want that your system is secure against an attacker, even if everybody knows every little detail about the system. So you want that your system is secure, even if, for example, researchers and penetration testers and hobbyists can look into the system, figure out all the vulnerabilities, and tell you maybe how to fix them and how to improve the security. And really, you shouldn't rely on security by not knowing people how stuff is working. This can be a fair layer on top of your actual security. That certainly happens many times. But what we are seeing a lot in space is security by obscurity is like kind of the main defense lines, people not knowing how it works. And then when we come and we get insights from people, then this entire constructs get pretty shaky.
And so before I get into the technicalities of it, I'd like for you maybe to describe some of the things that are up there. Are they floating aimlessly? Are they controlled from a ground station somewhere? What are they responsible for as a device?
Sure. So there are probably many thousands of objects up there, and not every object in space is also a satellite. There are debris, there are dead satellites, and probably waste and other stuff. But technically, most objects that we are talking about in space, satellites, generally have some kind of, well, purpose and are controlled by a so-called ground station. So this purpose might be any application of satellite systems that is, for example, Earth observation. So you do images of the Earth to figure out how is land usage going, to get images to Google Maps and wherever you want to have them. There is obviously internet, which is pretty famous currently. If you're talking about OneWeb or Starlink, the internet is coming from space to Earth. There also talks about basically doing broadcasts, cell phone broadcasts from space, so that you don't need these towers all over the place anymore. There are things like research and science, obviously, like these like James Webb Telescope and other telescopes, Hubble Telescope, that are doing actual science in space. And technology testing. So before you do space missions, basically everything has been tested in space before. So you usually put individual components up onto satellites that only have the purpose of basically testing stuff. And you have a lot more telecommunications, not just the internet or old cell phone services, obviously also television services. And yeah, I'm sure I'm forgetting something. Well, for example, global navigation systems like GPS also up there. So you have a lot of services that are pretty vital, and they are all provided by some form of by satellites, and the satellites basically receive the service from a ground station. And so the ground station controls the satellite. It tells them where to look to and where not to look to. For example, don't look into the sun, face towards Earth, so that we get our service to Earth, because, well, that's what we want to do. And then you have usually some kind of like base station, ground station, whatever the exact term might be, that, for example, puts the internet service up to the low Earth orbit, where it gets like kind of reflected down to Earth so that people can get it. So this is kind of the general working area. So if you do this ground segment, which is these super large antennas oftentimes, but it doesn't have to, and it can also be a pretty small one. You have the space segment, which is all the satellites. It might be one satellite, or in the case of these new constellations, it might be thousands of satellites. And you have the user segment, which is really, for example, your smartphone is receiving the GPS service or Galileo, so it's a user segment device. And these are kind of the three fundamental segments in space.
So I'm quoting from the abstract. I'm quoting Sean. I want pizza now.
That's right.
No, not that quote. Another one says, many satellites are missing basic command and control traffic protection, allowing anyone, air quotes or asterisk, with a strong enough radio to control the satellites. That's scary and fun at the same time. So explain that. You were kind of going there with that when you were explaining, you can control a specific area. You don't need the big dish.
Exactly.
I mean, what kind of radio are we talking about here to get to a satellite?
So generally, when I'm talking about satellites, I'm usually talking about low Earth orbit satellites. I'm not sure this also applies to like medium Earth orbit satellites or geostationary. So generally talking about low Earth orbit satellites. So when people are thinking about what you need to like reach these satellites, they probably have like in front of them these gigantic dishes that you might be able to rent at like Amazon Web Services or that upcast television service. But the reality is you don't need that much. You can buy a full new antenna that can talk on UHF, so ultra high frequency or very high frequency, to low Earth orbit satellites, and you can get it for new basically for $10,000. Now this is obviously not super cheap, but it's, let's say, in the range of motivated hobbyists, and certainly in the range for motivated groups. And
not much for Dr. Evil, I think.
Exactly. So people assume kind of like you need to be like a nation state attacker, or you need all this like millions of equipment to reach your satellites. It's not the case. Like you can spend 10,000 now and you get yourself the ground station, and that you can talk to satellites with. And really most satellites are talking or getting their commands and sending their feedback on these like lower frequencies, like ultra high frequency, very high frequency, or even S-band, and that is enough really.
So let's go back to one of the things that Marco talked about, the security through obscurity. It's not a favorite model limited to only aerospace. We see it in industrial control systems and even IoT devices at home. And the reason I bring up the IoT devices at home, there's a whole dark web internet, maybe even publicly facing showdown where you can get open source information and intelligence about these devices. Certainly IoT, certainly industrial control systems. Do satellite devices end up there as well? Because I'm trying to figure out, okay, I have a radio. I spent the 10 grand. I'm a little smart. I can have it send signals, but I don't know what signal to send and where to send it unless what?
Yeah. So this is kind of the thing. So even though many of the satellites, as we have kind of mentioned, don't really have a strong security or security even at all, so you can just send commands up there. The problem is you don't know which commands, and this is really the kind of the security or obscurity that we're talking about. You need to know exactly how the shutdown command looks like. You need to know the exact bytes, the exact fields. On the internet, that's easy because all protocols are standardized, and for space, we also have a lot of protocols that are kind of the space internet, if you want to say so. Probably somebody's probably not happy about that term, but it kind of describes it. And the general protocols are to some degree standardized, but the final parts, which really describe the instructions, what the satellite should do, for example, steer in another direction or ignite the thruster or whatever, they are usually not standardized. And you really don't know how they look like unless you get, for example, the software like we did, and then you can figure it out. And this is kind of the veil of like obscurity that people in the space community use to protect their satellites. They just don't disclose how these formats exactly work, and this is kind of enough. And when you go to something like Shodan, where you find devices I don't want to say you will never find a satellite, maybe at some point, but currently when you search for satellite related stuff, you will probably have more luck finding, for example, the end user devices, for example, the the dishes that receive the internet service at some point, or in when you book an internet service, for example, and you get a dish, you can place it somewhere in the desert, and then you receive internet service. These devices, if they are not properly configured, they can show up and show down. And this has happened before. This was also a Black Hat talk many years ago. But satellites themselves usually don't, because they are not integrated into the actual internet. They are intended to talk to their ground station where their operators are positioned. So they're really kind of in their own network. So people think about them as something that only the operators can control, but this is exactly the case that is no longer the case, because you can just buy the ground station equipment and you can control them, but they won't show up on Showdown like that, because they're not part of the internet. They are not interconnected. And right now on your PC, you can't talk to one, because you would have to, or you would need control over a ground station, and then you can talk to them. Maybe, well, you can probably book like an Amazon Web Service and then try it, but that's a different deal.
So the title of your presentation is "Start with Houston, we have a problem," which is something we never really want to hear, unless it's in a movie, we just kind of make it fun, and then we resolve the problem if things goes well. But are we addressing this problem? I mean, you say you tested 19, if I'm not wrong, satellite manufacturer that all came down with some kind of like this security through obscurity issue. Is there an organization? Is there a global coming together of I'm thinking, NASA, I'm thinking, the European Space Agency, the Japanese one. Are we addressing this right now, or everybody's on his own?
So in the paper, we looked into 3 satellites specifically, like me and my colleagues, we looked into 3 satellites and reverse engineered them and figured out every detail about them. And since 3 is not a great sample for the thousands that are up there, we did a survey about, and we received responses from 19 people over like places like ESA, NASA, businesses, also some academics, and they basically gave us a broader picture. And there we kind of saw the lacking security, mostly, for example, access protection, but also issues with the general usage of protocols. And this is not something that you can just fix overnight, because you kind of have to test the stuff. So you can't just patch in an encryption into a satellite, because as I mentioned at the very beginning, every component that goes on a satellite has to be tested before. It's not kind of like has to be, but you want to be sure, because it's pretty hard going to space and fixing your satellite by hand. Not a lot of people can do this. So you really want to be sure that this works. And the problem with like access protection on satellites is, and I want to stress, people are doing it. It's just a lot of people are not doing it. So it's definitely not a completely unsolved topic. But the issue is that you have to be sure that you can recover your satellite. So for example, what happens if you lose the key? That is not something that people think about a lot about on Earth, because you can just go to the server and reset it. That is kind of the worst outcome that you could face. On space, your satellite might be gone, and this is kind of if the satellite was like $2 million, then that's a pretty terrible outcome. So putting stuff in space and like testing it, like command encryption authentication, is hard, because you have so many more factors to think about. And that's why it's not happening a lot. And when you think about how we can change this, there definitely pushes to change this. So we, for example, know that ESA, or when we talked to ESA about this, they were very open about it. They gave us a software because they were very interested in this topic, and we were in talks a lot with them to figure out what they can do to improve security, and they were very eager to do it. And they're, for example, now also hosting a kind of an academic workshop to figure out or find research to improve security on these assets. And for example, I'm also hosting a workshop on one of the security conferences called SpaceSec, where we also encourage the community, the research community, to identify issues in space, because that's kind of this step where we are at. We kind of have to even figure out what even are the problems, what are potential solutions, what are the challenges. We're kind of in the very early stages here. But it's definitely picking up speed. There's a conference, for example, in Europe called CySat, that is also picking up this topic. It's really a conference dedicated to satellite or space system security. And you can really see basically a lot of the big players being there and talking about security and talking about concrete things that they are doing to improve it. So the space community has always been, it's something that takes a lot of time to fix, because you need to test something on a satellite, and that takes years to plan a satellite, and then you have to test the satellite, and only then you can decide to put it on the next satellite. So if you do major decision chain or major changes like putting encryption or authentication on satellites, you really want to test this years, maybe even a decade in advance. And that's why adoption of fixes are so slow. And we are not just talking about encryption authentication for commands, we are also talking about everyday defenses that are employed on every computer that we are currently here using. And any device, any defenses against exploitation that are currently on modern operating systems, just standards for like 20 years or longer, they are also missing on these satellites. And this has reasons like because you can prove it that it works, or because it takes a little bit more energy. And there are all these small things that you have to think about, like double and triple the time on a satellite, that makes it hard. But people are definitely trying to get there, and I'm sure they will be getting there.
And I don't know if you have much insight to share on this, because your research is obviously looking for vulnerabilities. But do you have a sense to how well we look at this from a detection and response perspective? Because what we're talking about is figuring out where it's broken and finding a patch and putting it, well, building it right from the first place, and or patching it and putting it up securely before it can get compromised. But what about while it's up there? Are we able to monitor, and do we have mitigating controls for if something bad does surface?
That is indeed a question that we looked into. We kind of wanted to figure out, if we are taking a satellite right now, if we were to do this, how would the operators notice that this is actually happening? And the answer is they have some tools. They have, for example, counters how many commands were executed, how much traffic was received. And if they really monitor it, they can, for example, notice these kinds of things. But obviously, if you're talking about bigger satellites, when not just one person or two persons are responsible for controlling them, but maybe a large team, then this is obviously not kind of the way to go. You don't want to like figure out every single packet that goes to a satellite. And I obviously I can't speak for any government agencies or military or some secret stuff that companies are doing. Generally, I don't think there is much in the sense of, like, for example, honeypots, where you figure out what kind of attack is currently going on, and you want to figure out what the attacker is doing and how they're doing it. This for example, called honeypots. That's something we're doing on the internet. There are PCs that are specifically designed to look interesting to attackers, so that people attack them, and so that we can figure out how the attack works. Something like this we are currently researching for satellites, but it's I don't think something that is let's say widely deployed, if at all.
Oh, I'm just curious, and I don't know if it's a stupid question or not, but I'm stupid, so that's okay. You focus on the low Earth orbits, and so what it makes harder, the one at a higher Earth orbit, is the fact that they're harder to reach, or they're actually conceptualized different? Like, are they actually safer? I mean, I know it's not your thing, but I think it's a pretty wide question that maybe you know the answer.
So we looked into low Earth orbit because the satellites are a lot smaller, they're a lot more, and that's why it's easier to find somebody that shares this software with. When you go above low Earth orbits, then you have to deal from a satellite engineering perspective with a lot more difficulties. Like, you will have a lot more radiation and probably a lot of stuff that I'm not qualified to talk about. But generally the satellites get a lot bigger, and with bigger satellites you generally have a lot more money, and this comes from the fact that a small satellite might just weigh 1 kilogram. They're actually pretty small, like 10 by 10 by 10 centimeters. That is 1.3 kilograms. That's kind of a standardized format. But these gigantic satellites that weigh multiple tons, they obviously have a lot bigger budget. And what we have seen in our survey is that when you have a lot more budget, people are able to consider security a lot more. Yet we still haven't seen any of the we've kind of seen the let's say, baseline defense, like encrypting and authenticating in telecommands. But anything beyond that, we haven't seen on any satellite, and we haven't seen that anybody answered about any of these defenses on our survey. So I would assume that they will have these like default protections that you should have, so that not just anybody with a ground station can take control of these like big low Earth orbit satellites. But apart from that, like the default defenses, like if for people knowing more insights about security, like ASLR or stack cookies, it's something that I would expect not to find there either. But I haven't looked into this. I don't know that.
Yeah, I didn't want to put you in a spot. I was just thinking, like, if I'm a listener right now, I probably would like to ask that question. So I did. Thank you.
No, it's a good question. It's these teams have a lot more money, and obviously usually they are put up there by big corporations that have a significant interest. If they lose one of these satellites, it might just be a pretty big issue for the business in general. So they go there with different considerations, and this, I hope, results in according security measures, but I don't know.
As long as I can still find the best pizza in New York through my navigation enabled app, I'm doing all right. So now, all joking aside, I mean, super important topic, obviously, and I'm grateful to see that you're doing this research with some of your peers and colleagues, and obviously we didn't give anything away. Right. We're just talking about in general. You have all the goods to share during your talk at Black Hat on Thursday, the 10th at 1:30 Pacific, obviously. So 40 minutes of goodness from Johannes there, all the deets from the research you did. And yeah, I'm excited to hear more about that. And hopefully people get a chance to talk to you afterwards as well.
I'm absolutely
to build this community up. Yep.
Absolutely. So you will definitely be able to talk to me after the talk. Just come to me, and I'm happy to discuss any space issues, space security issues, really anything. And I hope you all like to talk if you get a chance to hear it.
Perfect.
Very cool.
Yep. I love it. Well, thanks, Johannes, for joining us and giving us a sneak peek into your session. Hopefully everybody joins you there. And thanks, everybody, for listening to another Chats on the Road to Black Hat USA, Las Vegas, part of summer camp, of course. So stay tuned. We have many more. Another one from the Aerospace Village, not too far from this moment. So stay tuned for that one as well. And everything else coming to you from Las Vegas that we're covering. So stay tuned.
Thanks for having me.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you learned something new and this story made you think, then share ITSPmagazine with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our columns. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.